So this is Megan Jones from ICEA, welcoming you to another one of ICEA's Webinar Wednesdays, featuring one of the many presentations that were scheduled for our sadly canceled workshop in San Antonio. This and all of the distance learning series webinars this summer will count as an hour of training towards your CCEA recertification. So keep your confirmation in your records for when your certification is due. And if you don't have your certification, you're already getting your points, so maybe you want to look into that. Anyway. With us today is an avid and enthusiastic supporter of ICEA, Doug Howarth from MEE Incorporated. Today's presentation has been specially calibrated, so you guys don't need special glasses to watch. But here comes a 3-market, 10-dimension trade.
Chelsea, thanks for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming to my presentation. We're going to look, as the title suggests, at a bunch of markets at the same time. And it turns out that we're going to need to have multiple dimensions to look at them. So we're going to take a look and we'll see what this will do for us. So what we're looking at is a new way to solve long-standing problems. You're actually performing trades like this all the time. This is just a way to actually quantify that. And in order to show you how you might apply that to your problems, we're going to pick a problem to solve. And that will entail analyzing markets that are related to one another. And then we'll put them together, literally. And then we're going to draw some conclusions from the information we get. So it's really as straightforward as this in practice. And so what we want to do is to get the practice going. So since we're talking about dimensions, it's going to be very important here at the beginning to talk about the types of dimensions that we're looking at. So as Megan was telling you at the beginning, you could maybe use your 3D glasses at a theater, where you get, in addition to the width and the height of the screen, you get some sort of impression of the depth of the screen. And that of course, is dimension in a spatial context. But what we're looking at here, since these are markets, we're looking at economic or mathematical dimensions. And as you can see here from these definitions, mathematical dimensions have different features. And we're going to use these features to our advantage to be able to plot multiple dimensions at the same time and then try to make sense of them. So to give you an overview of how this works, we're going to go back to something that you know that does relate to spatial dimensions. We're going to ask ourselves, what two countries are these? So you might think to yourself, I know what countries these are. Now, to me, that the country on the left kind of looks like Delaware upside down, and most of you will probably recognize the country on the right. The country on the right, of course, is Australia. And the country on the left is Argentina. And so here's a little cocktail party question you can ask your friends if we ever have cocktail parties again. You can say, where do these two countries touch? Somebody might say to you or to me, said, well, Doug, you're crazy. It's Australia's a continent that doesn't touch anywhere at all. And you'd be right about that. We're going to see that they do in a way touch, and we're going to ask ourselves, why is that important? So when you're going to these cocktail parties, to be named later, where do these countries touch? Well, their territories, the territorial claims of Antarctica touch at the South Pole, as you can see here. Argentina's got a wedge of land here, and Australia has a couple of wedges here. They meet at the South Pole, really close to the South Pole Station the United States has. And of course, their airspaces for these territories abut one another along the Earth's axis. So why would this be an important concept in trying to extend dimensions? Well, we might ask ourselves, what would happen if, instead of calling the South Pole 90 degrees south, we called it 0, just for giggles. And if we're at 0, and we take, say, one step north, and every step you take away from the South Pole is north. If we take one step north into Argentina, we could say that we've gone in a positive direction. Now, if we take a step back, going south, back to the South Pole, and then take a step into Australia, well, that step 2 is northerly, but it's also positive. And the important point here is that positive Argentina space is not negative Australia space, or vice versa. We're going to find that that seemingly innocuous piece of information turns out to be pretty important to be able to create plots of multiple dimensions. Turns out that opposing non-negative systems are the key to seeing more information at the same time. So that's what we're off to here. So it's interesting, Christian Smart, my collaborator on our podcast and good friend, just asked me a question today about hypersonics. And Christian, it's almost like you're a straight man for this, this presentation, because this presentation is considering hypersonics. And why am I considering hypersonics as it applies to multiple markets? Well, several years ago, the United States decided that they wanted to be able to absolutely positively deliver a payload someplace in an hour. It's basically a riff off of the FedEx motto. When it absolutely positively has to be there overnight, PGS, Prompt Global Strike, wants to deliver a payload anywhere on the planet in an hour. And so we're asking ourselves what the features of the missile should be, but it's really, what are the features of a system that could deliver this missile be? Now, why do I say a system? Well, it had been the case that several people trying to solve this problem said to the people that wanted it, they said, well, you know, we can solve the Prompt Global Strike system by launching these little things we call ICBMs, or sub-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the problem with ICBMs is that they look a lot like ICBMs, and so if you point one off to a place that's near Russia, it could look to the Russians like it's flying to Russia. And so the cooler heads have prevailed in the Pentagon, and they've decided pretty much they're not going to do that. If we're allowed, you might be able to drop these things from space, but there's a whole bunch of treaties that say you can't do that. So it's probably the case that if you want to drop a payload anywhere in the world, you're going to probably have to do it from the air, and you're going to probably want to get there with a prompt, very prompt missile, which would be a hypersonic. And we're going to look at what this means here. So what we want to do then is ask ourselves, well, what kind of missiles, air-launched missiles, do we have now? So here's a survey of the missiles and the glide bombs that we, the United States, bought over a 20-year period. So here's their 2016 price. Here's their quantity over this period, again, 20 years. And here are their other parameters. Now we're including glide bombs just to show you that, in theory, if you could get a bomber over that, maybe you could do this mission with a really fast bomber. So we wanted to be able to consider that too. It also helps give us more variables so that we don't overspecify the problem here. So this is the history that we have in the United States of buying these guys. Well, if you were to plot the quantity of missiles from that previous slide, so again, backward here, if you were to plot the quantities against the prices, price and quantity in economics are the two axes for demand curves. And so here we have quantities across the horizontal axis and prices on the vertical. We have the glide bombs down here in brown, glide bombs. And then up here in blue, we have the powered missiles. And very interestingly and crucially, these points form what is known as the demand frontier. The demand frontier is the line that defines the outer boundary, as it suggests, of the frontier of the market. And you can't exceed it except by a little bit here in the markets in which they form. So this is highly correlated, and this is basically saying this is the limit the market has placed on itself for these types of devices. And you say to yourself, well, look, if we want to make a hypersonic air to surface missile. So it's probably going to cost more, and we're not going to be able to afford very many. So what would happen if we decided to make 25 or 50 of them? And you can just take this and take that data and then run it back into the curve. You can find that you have these limits here, a little over 5 and roughly 7.5 for 50 and 25 of these devices, respectively. So what can we do with that? Well, what we might want to do is take a look then at the value of these missiles. And when we do that, we get an equation that describes the value in terms of this constant here, their range, a step function that says they're either gravity driven or they're powered. It's basically 2 to the third. That's a multiplier of 8, and then a momentum term, mass times velocity times an air term. And then how that appears then is like this: is that we have the price. There's a constant here, and then there's a range term. So we have some of these glide bombs that only go a few kilometers here, and then we have missiles that go 1,000 kilometers. And then they have this momentum term, mass times velocity here. And it works out that the glide bombs have their own surface down here. And then 2 to the 3, this is another way to show a dummy variable. We just like to do that. It's a little bit of, it compresses the Excel file for us. That steps up this plane, and we have this missile response surface here. And so if we pay particular attention to the axes that we had just seen, so we had just witnessed a demand curve in which we had a horizontal quantity dimension and a vertical price dimension. And over here we have a pair of horizontal dimensions. We have range and we have momentum, and we got a vertical price dimension. And we recall that we had just seen that at the South Pole, and going vertically from that, the airspaces of the Argentinian and Australian claims abut one another. If we put all those things together, we can come up with some ordered quads that describe where these points are in space. And it's going to look like this. So this is a coordinate system that's got 4 dimensions to it. And so in this case, we've got the 3 dimensions we just saw, which are range, dimension 1, momentum, dimension 2, and price. And then from 2 slides ago, we had quantity and price. So since this plane and that space share this common axis, we don't need to count this dimension twice. So the way you look at plotting in 4 dimensions is you use ordered quads. And so let's take a look here. We have the blue 111 here. It's got a range of 28 clicks. So here's 10 to the 1. There's 10 clicks. There's 100 clicks. Somewhere in between here, there's 28 kilometers. There's got an MV term, mass times velocity. So features that its mass, velocity, its momentum, and its range determine its value. And its value determines its price, which is here, 32,000, and the price then determines the quantity sold here. Similarly, the AGM 158-1, this is the Jason missile. This has got the longest range in the database right now. So it's got a 1,000-kilometer range here. And it's got this MV term, so its momentum and its range combine to produce this value. And that value in turn turns into this quantity here, which is quite a bit lower, 275. And then in between is the AGM 84. It's got a range of 270 kilometers. So here's 100, there's 1,000, it's in between. It's got this momentum. These features combine for this price here, 528, which then in turn leads to this quantity, 4152. So it's greater than 1,000 and not quite 10,000. And so what's very interesting and useful is that less only the markets for commodities. And what do I mean by commodities? Well, gold, silver, copper, oil, things like that, less only pure commodities. All markets behave this way. So what can we use that for? We're about to find out after we do some more analysis here on the bombers. So we figured out that our missile system needs to have a bomber to carry it. And so what we want to do is go out and find a bomber history. So we don't have a lot of current bombers at any one time. So what I did was I went back 60 years and brought up all the long-lived devices that we use that drop ordnance. And I wanted to create a demand frontier out of it. In fact, one person critiqued me. He says, well, you can't show stuff over 60 years. The demand will change. I said, well, the demand will change. Sure, it changes every time you have a delivery. But surprisingly, at the frontier, the limit of the market that we saw, at the frontier, well, it hardly changes at all. What do I mean by that? Well, let's plot where the frontier was using that data in 1996 in red, 2006 in gray, and 2016 in blue. So you see vehicles like the F-16 are still being built, the F-18 still being built, the B-2 was being built here. What happens is the frontier, yeah, it changes, but it changes by about, it's changed by about 2% over 20 years. Not very much. So some market changes are very small, and the frontier is very long-lived. And what that means then is that we can pretty much rely on this limit to determine how much we're going to be able to sell in any one market based on the relationship between quantity and price. That's what this frontier is. It's the relationship between quantity and price. So that frontier has deep implications for the B-21 bomber. If you plot, this is basically a zoomed in portion of the chart you just saw. So here again is the quantity, here are the prices. Here is the demand frontier. And the B-21 wants to have 100 units at this 2016 price. And the chance, that turns out that that is 9, because this is highly correlated. This is 9 full standard deviations past that limit, which means that the chance of this happening is much less than 1 in a billion. Now, it'll probably take us 20 years to get to that point, but this is your first indication that you've got no chance of doing that. And that's important from the standpoint, if you're somebody that's trying to plan, again, for a PGS, a prompt global strike system to be launched, you want to be able to know this in advance to figure out what you're going to do. Now, what's interesting here is when you compute the value of the bombers, as I have here, it works out that the value of the bombers, and again, I'm not considering stealth here. You could, if you had all the data, it would make it a classified document. I can't show you classified stuff here. So if you had stealth, that would clearly add to the value of a product, including the B-21, the B-2, and the F-117. If you had stealth, and the F-12, I'm sorry, if you had stealth, that would add to this. But what we can get from the available data is we know that there's a value to the speed and a value to the payload. And very importantly, it turns out that there's, after you account for the constant here, there's a value to the quantity that you have here, which is highly correlated. It's got a very, very low p-value, which is to say that as the quantity increases, the value, the sustainable price to the market starts to fall. And you notice that this exponent here is highly negative, much more negative than any learning curve you're going to see. And so that has implications. Well, what are those implications? Well, let's take a look. So here's what happened to the B-2. We know we sold 21 of the government bought 21 B-2s. And we know that their unit price in 2016 dollars is an average cost. And so if you take the average cost back, at a certain point back here, supposing we had a 79% incremental learning curve here. That's just a guess, but it solves the math here. If you suppose you have that, that means that there was a learning curve that existed here that was running down, and 79% would be relatively steep. But the product demand curve, equation 4 in the paper, the product demand curve, because of this exponent here, is steeper. And what that means is that it starts out, the implied value of this is very high when it began, you know, approaching, this is 9, 8, 7, it's approaching $7 billion here. But the market, that is, in this case, the US Air Force, the market buys products when the value exceeds the cost. But at a certain point, if this demand curve is steep enough, and this one is, the value will eventually equal the cost. And beyond that point, the cost will exceed the value, and that's when production stops. And so the point here is that if the data reveals product demand curve, it should always be compared to the demand frontier in its market, because that's going to indicate a limiting value that you're going to have for that product. So you can also use this value equation to calculate production possibility curves. So what do I mean by that? Now, in econ books, you may have seen production possibility curves as curves that hypothetically show you the relationship between guns and butter, or, you know, pick any two discrete elements that you want. But when you're building a certain product, what you're trading is not guns and butter. You're trading the features that you have within the product. Well, so what features were we looking at with the bombers? Well, we were looking at range and payload, right? And so what we can do then, looking at range and payload, these are the points that describe the range and payload of the vehicles that we're looking at before. These are the UAVs that we had here. Here's the demand frontier over here. And so based on that demand frontier, the target value, the target quantity is 100, but the data suggests that the price that they're posting, that they're going to get 55. And so if you come over here, this forms a price limit at this quantity, and 100 also forms a price limit. And then what we can do is take that equation that we just saw from the previous chart and then set the quantity to either 100 here or 55 here, and this will create a plane. And this plane here and this plane here intersect their corresponding horizontal planes, and they're going to form production possibility curves, which we're going to look at close to the end of this exercise here. So right now, what this has allowed us to do is in the bomber market, we figured out we have some demand frontiers. Have a demand frontier we have to negotiate, and we've got a production possibility curve that's going to dictate the mass of the product we're going to be able to carry, and its range. So this will get us production possibility curve. So I promised 3 markets in 10 dimensions, and so thought that we might want to look at tankers. Vehicles that are in the air for quite a time need to have tankers, and so I pulled up this tanker database. And for those of you in the know, you might think that it's pretty small, and it is. And this is my cut at active tankers. These are hard to define. This is my best cut at it. And so again, I've got quantities and prices. And what's very important here is the max payload, the number of years they've been operational. And the newer tankers, as you can imagine, even adjusted for inflation, are more expensive. And so when we plot all that stuff together, we get this. It turns out that you can get again, in the paper, it shows there's a value response service that describes the value of the tanker in terms of the payload that it carries and its age. The newer it is, the more we're willing to pay for it. The same thing happens in operations, by the way. So the newer ones are more reliable. The older ones aren't. Of course, they didn't have the technology that the newer ones had. So this is showing the response to this. And then we get a demand frontier here. It looks like it correlates well, but there's only 4 points, so it's not statistically significant. But the observation that we make here is that we can characterize this market, but when we stop back and think about it, the prompt global strike system wants to deliver anything within an hour. And so if that's going to happen in an hour, and the separation of the missile from the plane happens inside of an hour, the plane is going to only be up for, say, an hour and a half max. There's none of these planes run out of fuel in an hour and a half, and so therefore we're not going to be using tankers here. So like in math, where you get to cancel out a term, in this case we get to cancel out a whole market. That market for this exercise doesn't appear to be in action. We're not going to use it. So based on what we saw for the missiles and the bombers, each of them had a 4D view. If we jam them together, as shown here, we get a 7D view. So what does a 7D view look like? Well, it looks like this. What does it mean, you might ask me? Well, recall for the missiles, we had dimension 1 was their range, dimension 2 was their momentum. We had a price axis here, and so notice that we've rescaled this so that we can put both markets in at the same time. So we put the scale longer here, and now here's the responses for the missiles, and here's the responses for the bombers. So here's the quantities, and here's our demand frontier for missiles. But just in the same way that we found that Australia and Argentina abutted one another, we can abut the bomber market to the missile market. Let me say that again. We're going to abut the bomber market to the missile market. And what that means then is that we had 4 dimensions for the bombers. We had range and speed and price and bomber quantity. Now, of course, the bombers have the same price axis as the missiles do. Therefore, we don't need to replicate it. Therefore, we only need to add of the dimensions 5, 6, and 7 to get a complete view of both markets. Now, you could draw this in any kind of engineering program. I happen to choose for this. This is, if anybody's interested, this is drawn in a computational fluid dynamics program called TechPlot. So I just basically figured out how to get TechPlot to work in 4 dimensions and then 7, and as we're going to see here some more a little bit later. So you might say to yourself, well, Doug, you promised us 10 dimensions and you got to 7. You're going to need to do a little bit more work to get us to 10 dimensions. And if you said that, you'd be absolutely correct. Well, so how are we going to get to that point? Well, so here what we're going to do is we're going to look at a different market that I happen to have drawn out already just for giggles to show you about how we can do some more data compression. So here's the value and demand for a series of general aviation planes, the Cessna Caravan, the Beech Baron, and the Cirrus SR-22. So we've got their seats, 4, 6, and 8, their cruise speeds over here. And then by extension, we've got their prices here. And then we have their quantities here. Now, this is drawn neatly with right-angled planes like we see in the Cartesian systems. And we might ask ourselves, as I asked myself, so, well, what does it really mean to be on this demand plane? If any of you are my age or about that, you might remember going into record shops and seeing posters on an axle. Or another way to look at this is pages in a book. And the book or the posters have an anchoring point, an axle, an axis. And then they've got horizontal information. and they have vertical information, but their information is not determined by their angle relative to any other page in a book or any other poster in a poster rack. Because of that, we don't have to abide by the default condition of orthogonality here. So what can we do with that then? Well, what we can do then is we can start to swing this demand plane over. In fact, we swing this demand plane over until it abuts the value space. And by doing that, then, we've not lost the demand data. We still have the horizontal component of the demand data, and we have the vertical component of the demand data, much like, again, a poster or a page in the book. And so now, for those of you keeping up here, is that we've managed to pull up another 90 degrees worth of arc. He said, now we can put in another couple markets if we needed to. But like all good analyses, you get to a certain point, you say, well, why should we stop there? Can't we do more stuff? Can we get more information into this kind of view? Let's ask ourselves that question. Well, let's suppose we're looking down on top of a right-angled set of data. So imagine we're looking down on a value space in my vernacular. This is 10 to the 0, so this is 1. Because this is log space, we're doing a little bit of fudging. At a certain point, we'll call this is going to go to 0. So we're going out by factors of 10 with respect to features 1 and 2. And we've got these whole number of values here as we look down here for these elements here. And then these are a bunch of, the green dots are jet business aircraft, and the brown dots are turboprops, just for giggles. And what we want to do is we want to say, well, what would happen if we started to compress this? So imagine being in a hotel. You've probably seen these collapsible mirrors on the wall, or you may have seen these things called scissor lifts that people use to as a platform for workers to go up and change lights or do painting or hang stuff on buildings. And what they have is they have a series of links. So let's just imagine that each one of these segments here is a link. And if you imagine that, in fact, these links, if you do a little more research, these links basically form what's known as a pantograph. And a pantograph is what Jefferson used to create the world's first copying machine. He worked out a way to make duplicates with a pantograph. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the polar coordinates as we adjust this angle away from 90 degrees. And so imagine then that this is one valued feature and this is another valued feature. Remember, we've already swung the demand plane around so that it's abutting this. We didn't show it here, but imagine we swung the demand plane around. We got two valued features here. And now we want to adjust these angles away from 90 degrees. And what happens is, well, we don't lose track of where these things are, just like the extendable mirror in a bathroom, in a hotel, or a man lift. We can track this angle very easily. And it's just a matter of its distance from each of the axes. And very importantly, we can go to any angle that we want, and then we can return back to 90 degrees if we need to. And so, again, crucially here, these systems convert from log polar to log Cartesian, vice versa. And why are we doing this? Well, we want to have data compression, which is going to allow us to do more analytics. So what's the next extension of this, you might ask? Well, let's take a look. So let's start with one market here. And so again, it's a little bit of a fudge. We're starting from 10 to the minus 0. We can imagine eventually this would be 0. And we're going to go out in factors of 10. Now this green dot, this green circle here is eventually going to be GDP. And so we're going to start with one market, and its pie section is its pie portion of GDP. And then we're going to track the rest of its information. Again, it's valued 1 feet axis and it's valued 2 axis. And again, with the demand plane being swung around that, we're going to track all of that information at the same time. So what does that mean then? Well, in this case, this market's got 10 degrees of arc. One market, 10 degrees of arc, so 10 divided by 360. It's got that portion of GDP. Or it could be that portion of a company's revenue, say, for example. But very importantly, we can adjust this to the market size if we needed to. So we can just adjust this to whatever size that particular market is. And now we realize, well, if we can do that for one market, well, we could do that for more markets. So why don't we do that? So we're doing that here. So we add a second, and then we say, well, you know, we got a third, and we're going to maybe make adjustments to that, and maybe we'll have a fourth and a fifth, and so on. And so what we're discovering here then is that if the green circle is GDP, each one of these pie sections represents that market's portion of GDP. And of course, then at this, the next observation is that, well, geez, there's really no limit. Using this kind of technique, there's no limit to the number of markets we can look at. There's a number of markets we can consider. There's no limit. So again, these value planes determine the portion that market is taken of GDP. Now we're gonna look at a couple of examples of that, including our 10-dimension view, and then we're gonna look at another view where we get more arc between these two value planes. But this next one is not going to show very much market for any of these markets, because in the scheme of the world, none of these markets are very big. So what do I mean by that? Well, here is that 3-market 10D view that we need to have to be able to analyze this market. So how do we read this? Well, let's start from the center core. A little bit of a fudge here. The center of this is 10 to the minus 4, or eventually we hope to call that 0. This green circle here is 10 to the 0. That means that's 1. So if pi r squared h equals the volume of a cylinder, then again, a little bit of a fudge here. If we start at 1 penny, exclude the bottom penny, then we take the GDP and divide it by pi and take its log. We come up base 10 log. We come up with this. It's 13.444. So this is the world GDP in a cylinder. And as we go out radially, these are describing the lateral extent of each market. The way we read this is to start with the missiles, is that the upper extent of each of these planes is the costliest element in each of the markets. And so in the case of the missiles, we saw the missiles were approaching $2 million. So this is the most costly missile. Down here we had stuff in the neighborhood of $30,000. That's the least expensive. And then the outer edge of each plane represents its maximum value for that year. So we had some pretty high momentum terms, and then we had some pretty high demand terms, and then we had range, which was down around 1,000. So that would have been out 10 to the 3. And then we do the same thing for bombers. Very importantly here, bombers, there were only a couple being built here, so the ranges, the range from the top to the bottom wasn't very great, but we had a little bit more range in the tankers, and then their lateral extents came out as shown here. Now you're not seeing very much angularity between the planes here, so what we're going to do then is say, well, let's look at a 16D 5-market view of some other markets, and we can actually show some separation here. And why am I doing this? Well, I'm showing this is for two reasons. One is to give you a cleaner look of some markets that have wider ranges. So, for example, the market for internal combustion cars here is, again, the lateral extent represents the demand in a year, and that's in the tens of millions. Then this green plane, the upper range is the price. There are cars that are over $1 million. There's cars that are down the few thousand range. The outer range here is the horsepower here, and horsepower was greater than miles per gallon. But between these two planes, you can start to see an arc open up, and this arc is the biggest market that we have here. In fact, all these markets combined add up to about 3% of GDP. And what's important from looking at this particular view is that we note that when we had one market, we had two value variables and one quantity variable and one currency variable for a total of 7. When we add the second one, we added 2 more value variables, quantity variable, but very importantly, we kept the currency dimension. We went to 3, we had 6 value variables, 3 quantity variables, and so on. So what we discover then is for end markets, we have 2 n value variables, n quantity variables, and 1 currency variable for 3n plus 1 markets. And so to plot n markets, you need 3n plus 1 dimensions. This is about 3% of GDP. So now going all the way back to the beginning, talking about these production possibility curves that we had, we discover that over here we have the missile production possibility curves. Here is the actual curve that we have. Nobody's going as much as 1,000 kilometers, so this is an extrapolation. This dotted line here, this represents what a heavyweight punch is. So if you extrapolated this out to say, 12,000 kilometers, this is what a heavyweight puncher could get. In theory, you could get a missile to go that far from the air, but you want to be able to go further with more punch, and this is what you can hypothetically get. This is an extrapolation again for 7.5 million and 5.2 million. And here's what we can get for 55 million. This is the production possibility curve for payload and speed. And it's showing you that basically we could get 40,000 kilos and nearly high subsonic speeds for a decent price here. And so what's the conclusion that we get out of all this then? Well, the conclusion we get then is that the market does not support 100 B-21s at 610 million, which means that in order to do prompt global strike, we're going to need to have more aircraft close to more targets. The missiles can't go a super long range, which means if you want to get everywhere in the plant, you're going to have lots of B-2s, B-21s, and maybe B-52s, so that you can be able to accomplish the market. The hypersonics that we saw are an extrapolation, and in the armed services and any other project you do, in fact, in your household, many markets compete with other markets. You can get, a higher horsepower car. It's more fun to drive. It takes more gas. It creates more insurance. So there's trades across 3 markets then. So you've been doing these trades your whole life, and these methods shown here allow you to quantify them and to reveal what you can and can't do. And so with that, I will turn it over to questions.
Well, I have to say, so far we haven't gotten any, so either you've given them so much food for thought or you've completely boggled their minds with all these dimensions. I'll chit chat for a minute so we can give you guys some time to ask some more questions if you have them. You'll see Doug very graciously put up our information about the next year's workshop in Minneapolis. If you've been enjoying these webinars and you want to get in on this, we're accepting abstracts for next year's workshop at ICEAonline.com/CFP2021, or you can click the button at the top of the ICEA webpage. Well, we got one comment, not a question. Very well done. So that's a positive.
Well, then
Do you
I'll ask my second question, if that's okay, Megan.
Attaboy, good idea.
Yeah. So let's just try to make some more, what sense can we make out of these production possibility curves? Well, again, the reason we can make them is because there's a trade-off that we have between these features. And we told ourselves we want this, but we haven't given consideration to what happens that we need this. We need to have 100 vehicles in order to pull this off. What ended up happening with the B2 is that we as a country started out with a requirement for 132 of them, and then it became 100, and of course eventually we ended up with 21, and we're going to march down much the same path with the B21 if we don't regulate it. So a lot of people say, well, I'm going to lose all kinds of capability. Well, you're certainly losing capability, but you might say, well, how much capability is enough? Well, it looks like you've got, a 40,000 kilo payload going high subsonic here. And so this is actually not a bad plane, especially if it's stealthy. So you can imagine that plane flying for 30 to 50 minutes at high subsonic speed, and then launching a hypersonic missile that's going at 4,000 miles an hour that might have a range of, say you could get it up to 2,000 clicks. Then you have to figure out how close you need to be to your targets in order to cover all the targets you want to cover. Now, you're not going to cover, you're looking at Antarctica at the beginning, you're not going to cover Antarctica. You're probably not going to cover South America or, most of Africa. You've got other targets that you're going to cover. So what does it take to make that kind of coverage possible? Well, this is showing you what it takes. And the reason for doing this is very often, in fact, it's my view, all the time, the bomber people, both in the Pentagon and in industry, these are different groups than these groups. And so eventually these two groups come together. The products of these two groups come together for users. You could do the same thing here for, you can imagine this would be aircraft engines for airliners, and this would be airliners. And then eventually the operator of the airliner, the operator of a manufactured airplane is an airliner. So you've got three distinct industries that need to work together. In that case, it would be engines, airframe manufacturers, and airliners all need to work together in order to solve a problem. And so what's happening here is eventually operators in the field, planners, need to be able to take what they have, the missiles that they have and the bombers that they have, and marry them together to be able to solve their problems. And it's my contention that we're not really working towards their goals so much as the goals of people in this one industry and the people in another industry. And that is detrimental. So that's what I was trying to get to with this. Same thing happens for all the government agencies we have.
I'm
Yes,
sorry.
ma'am.
Yes, we did. We got another question that came in. It's a little bit of a different direction, but Stu Swalgen, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, good morning.
Stu, hi.
Hi. Yeah, in terms of using multiple dimensions to characterize and understand a market, yeah, I was wondering, and I know you and I've touched on the topic a little bit, and it's been in some dialogues on LinkedIn and so on. When we look at a given market, if you were to apply this to, I was thinking again the COVID pandemic situation and viruses in general and what we might look for in the future, we try to characterize I'll call it the market behavior of a virus from a multidimensional standpoint. Could we use the methodology to understand and prepare for and better respond to these kinds of situations in the future? Being able to look at the many dimensions that simultaneously like this would kind of suggest even a broad application. So
Funny you should mention that, Stu. I happen to have something for that right here. Hold on, please. I'm still displaying my screen, right, Megan?
Oh, sure. You're showing your whole.
Yeah, we see
right.
it.
Okay. Well, here's COVID at work across 4 dimensions right here, Stu. And what this was looking at is very early on. This is back in April. It worked out that the higher the GDP, these are every one of these dots represents the number of cases per a country. And so over here we've got GDP per capita, and it's going up with GDP per capita. And it's also going up with population density, which is to be expected. Interestingly, it went up with GDP at the beginning, we think, because of the effect of wealthier people being able to move between country to country.
Mm-hmm.
And then here, this is Iceland, this is Ireland right here. We discovered there was an upper infection limit to COVID at the beginning, and that there was a lower infection limit here. So it might have been a function of how many tests were being run, but there was actually an upper and lower boundary to the illness. And instead of this being the value and demand of the disease, we look at this as being the ways in which COVID transmits, and this is the means by which it transmits. And so instead of having value and demand as the opposing forces, you have the ways and means that the disease can transmit itself. So it looks like there's ways to plot this, and then you can also add in the cost for the disease. So there's a biological cost that runs beneath here. There's the germ density that goes here. There's the germs per capita that would go here, and there would be germ population here. So there are reflective dimensions for bugs as it applies to people. And I posted this on my LinkedIn site, and several health professionals looked at it. Nobody said it was wrong. So
is there a corollary maybe to, where a market, the market those frontiers are kind of characterize the value proposition for a given capability or function, right? And so that gives you insight into what drives and how a given market might behave,
right?
And if value proposition is probably not the right term when looking at a virus, I'm not sure what is, but the same idea that how it wants to behave based upon consideration of these different dimensions could tell us what to kind of monitor for, where to be better prepared, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Stu, is that it does seem to have a corollary to what happens here in viruses. I think this would also, the same kind of analysis would work for athletes, which is to say that if you could suppose that if the vertical axis for an athlete, say a cyclist, were watts, and this were time, quantity of time,
Mm-hmm.
there's the demand curve for watts, and then the watts would be pushed up by something like the number of muscles being activated, and it might also be a function of the hemoglobin in the blood, which of course is why we found EPO out there. And so there's probably a plane or a surface that describes that, and then it would talk about the biological cost of doing that. So yeah, the point is here that I believe it's got applications in many other realms. So yes, thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea of being able to address the multiple dimensions, and brings it being able to look at beyond a product market into these other forms. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that's the reason for going back to here. Let's go back to the paper. That's the reason for having a view like this, is that
Yeah.
you want to be able to, you could draw something like this for your own company. Is that there is a view of your own company that looks a lot like this, that you could create and then try to do trades within it to show where you might want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, every day, and that's part of the issue with us, is what we're trying to do. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It does make my head hurt, but it's a good thing.
Well, I came up with it, made my head hurt, so I guess we're even. So. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really good way of showing how widely this works and how it works across all sorts of decisions, like you were saying before. And I think that's just about time. So with full heads, thank you very much, Doug, for being with us. Everybody on the line, I hope to hear you next week when we go into some lessons learned from implementing EVM on government-led delivery efforts. You go ahead, Doug.
I just want to say thank you, everybody, for showing up to my presentation, and thanks for taking the time to listen to it. Very much appreciate it.
And thank you for taking part in it. We really appreciate it. So, Doug, everybody on the line, have a great rest of your day. Great week. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, and be well.
All right. Thank you.